An education system that increases the gap between the rich and the poor. As a new report calls for an overhaul of US schools, we examine why social mobility is becoming unattainable. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. Study after study in the US has shown that the rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. And now a report commissioned by the US Congress says the American education system is largely to blame. The study released on Tuesday says, quote, 10 million students in America's poorest communities are having their lives unjustly and irredeemably blighted by a system that consigns them to the lowest performing teachers, the most run-down facilities, and academic expectations and opportunities considerably lower than what we expect of other students. So, what's become of the American dream? Despite growing up with economic hardships, do you still have the opportunity for prosperity and financial success through hard work? It's a notion that President Obama recently alluded to in his inaugural address.
We are true to our creed when a little girl born into the bleakest poverty knows that she has the same chance to succeed as anybody else because she is an American, she is free, and she is equal not just in the eyes of God, but also in our own.
But the Equity and Excellence Report on Education says that in no other developed country has the system stacked the odds against so many of its children. Earlier, I spoke to one of the authors of the report, Stanford professor Linda Darling-Hammond.
It's a shocking state right now. We have about 1 in 4 children in this country living in poverty. Increasingly, children lack housing and health care and basic food security. In some cases in very concentrated, segregated conditions of poverty. And then we spend less money in schools on the education of those who are the least able to get education outside of school. So this builds up a kind of inequality that doesn't exist in most of the industrialized nations around the world.
So key to the findings of your report is a concept of equity. Can you explain what that means?
Well, by equity, we mean that each child should have the opportunity to get the education that will allow them to succeed today in the economy and the society that we have. That means there ought to be a level playing field for funding of schools. The curriculum that students get access to should be comparable so that everyone has a level playing field in going out into the economy. And children should come to school ready to learn, having had the health care, the housing, and the preschool opportunities that will allow them to really take advantage of what schools offer.
As far as funding is concerned, equity doesn't necessarily mean equal funding for schools then.
Well, it may mean funding like that currently proposed in California by our governor, Jerry Brown, that gives more money for children who live in low-income communities, who speak English as a second language, who have special education needs, so that, in fact, we're able to ensure that they can access the curriculum.
So you're in effect reversing the sort of funding pattern we see in the rest of the country, though, where money tends to go to more affluent
That's
schools.
Right.
As far as equity...
That's right. Right now we have the reverse of that. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer in the education system.
How is it that we've got to a stage where it takes a blue ribbon panel to put forward these ideas, which again don't seem terribly revolutionary?
Well, we had a large press for equity back in the 1960s and 70s. There was a War on Poverty, a Great Society initiative. We put a lot of resources into equalizing opportunity, and it paid off. We had higher rates of college attainment and graduation for all children, white, black, Latino, than is the case in the more inequitable system that has emerged in the last 30 years. We have this unusual history in the United States. We were the first in the world in education in the 1970s. We put resources into public education before most countries did. town by town, school by school. But the local property tax that pays for that turns out not to be distributed equally. So our effort to create local schools now is not adequate for the job that it has to tackle today.
But arguably, it's felt that the Education Secretary, who you've now presented this report to, is one of the key proponents of a slightly more simple framework, that there are good or bad schools. He seems to be a proponent of a great focus on standardized testing, a punitive approach to all these things. Aren't all these recommendations going to fall on deaf ears?
We think that there's very fertile ground for these recommendations. We know the Secretary has been eager to welcome them. We do think that the framework for school reform in this country, which goes back more than a decade now of largely investing in testing and sanctions tied to testing, has not been adequate to the job, and we certainly say that in the report. But we think that there is a readiness and an eagerness on the part of people on both sides of the aisle to move forward.
What's that based on? And of course, there is that Washington narrative that there isn't the money for any great school reform right now.
Well, if you want to look for resources to invest in schools, you have to look in a couple of places. One is that we've had a growing prison system. We have about 400% more people in prison now than we did a couple of decades ago. That system has grown enormously, 900% increase in the costs of the correction system, and now outstrips our investments in public higher education. One thing that states have to do is to begin to invest in education rather than incarceration, and flip those investments so that we're actually spending the money in the right way. We will spend in California $50,000 a year on an inmate for whom we would not have spent $10,000 a year a few years earlier to get him a good education. So we have to rethink those priorities. We also have to look at the enormous amount of money we put into defense spending, much more than a couple of dozen nations next in line for resources that could be better spent as well. When we look for where there may be room to cut, we have to look at places that will allow us to make the investments in our people that are necessary to be a strong country in this current world.
Joining us now from Stanford University is Sean Reardon. He is a professor of education and sociology and author of the Widening Income Achievement Gap. Here in the studio we have Mary Bruce, Senior Education Advisor for the public policy firm Civic Enterprises. And from Berkeley we're joined by Sylvia Allegretto, co-chair for the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California. Perhaps first of all, let's look at some of the statistics, starting with the achievement gap between rich and poor students that's grown substantially over the past few decades. This, as the gap between white and black students has fallen significantly. A study, in fact, by our guest, Professor Reardon, found that the gap in test scores between children from high and low income families had grown by about 40% since the 1960s. That's double the testing gap between blacks and whites. Another study concluded that the imbalance between the rich and poor in completing college had grown by about 50% since the 80s. A third study found that those with higher incomes, meanwhile, were spending 9 times more per child in 2007 than low-income families, and that gap was 5 to 1 back in 1972. Meanwhile, as far as the extent that you could surpass the education level of your parents, the OECD, the Economic Grouping of Developed Nations, found that only 29% of US children whose parents did not have an upper secondary education made it to college. And those odds are below every other OECD country except Canada and New Zealand. The US is only one of only 3 OECD countries that spend less on students from disadvantaged backgrounds than on other students. The OECD and many others recommend that the US safety net programs do more to address the needs of the poorest. Professor Reardon, then talk us through those numbers then. How did we get there?
Well, I think one way to think about it is that the United States in the 1950s and 60s was a country where racial inequality dominated socioeconomic inequality. Economic inequality was pretty low historically in the 50s and 60s, but racial inequality was very high on most dimensions: education, health, housing. And over the last 50 years, we've really reduced, but not eliminated, a lot of the racial inequalities in American society. But at the same time, economic inequality has grown dramatically, and we see that reflected in patterns of educational success. So now the disparities in educational outcomes between high and low-income students are much, much larger than they were 40 years ago, and much larger than black-white disparities.
Dr. Allegretto, to what extent do you feel that the notions of American exceptionalism and the American dream sometimes prevent these issues from being discussed, and perhaps the root causes from being addressed because they would be so destructive to some tenet, some sort of even economic dogma that's quite prevalent, particularly in Washington?
Yeah, I think we need to talk about this issue. This is an issue really of political will. This idea that we are the richest country in the world, and that if we didn't choose to invest in this, the reason we don't invest in this is because we can't. I mean, that's just a false narrative. This is a question of priorities. Much of what has made the U.S. great in the last decades was our investment in our people, human capital, in our educational systems. And what we're seeing is an unraveling of that system. We see a constant defunding of education in the U.S., especially K through 12. We're seeing a push, like we are in so many other areas of U.S. government work, where instead of the government providing for education, we see a push to privatize education, which I think is going to education, we think, should mitigate the inequality at the starting gate. We should help to bring everybody up to the starting line so everyone has equal opportunity. But the path that we're taking now is basically cementing those inequalities for life.
And that's interesting, because now we have this report, Mary Bruce, which has a number of recommendations. And I wonder to what extent, at least within the education community in Washington, that many of the ideas put forward are sort of out of fashion, really. I mean, the idea of equity, of putting more money in deprived areas rather than wealthy areas, of accountability of authorities, not just teachers, for the education level of the students, taking into account poverty and other social factors. That's rather out of fashion, isn't it? Yeah?
Well, I think there are also a lot of hope spots. We've actually seen tremendous progress in some areas. We're releasing a report on Monday, the 4th annual Building a Grad Nation update at the annual Grad Nation Summit here in Washington, D.C. And it'll be the latest data on graduation rates and dropout factory trends. And there's a lot of really encouraging news. And I think there's a question around how we're spending our educational dollars, how many dollars are going into education, but also how we're spending those dollars. And there have been recent trends towards using data more smartly, responding to data more aggressively.
Right, but the trends have also been, let's blame the teacher and let's bring private enterprise into this. Hasn't that been the major, isn't that what President Obama and his education secretary seem rather bewitched by?
I mean, I think bringing private enterprise into the education system can be a really good thing, not just the dollars, but also the expertise. We have examples from across the country where that public-private partnership has been a really big benefit, because schools can't necessarily do it alone.
Right, but it's all hit, I mean, again, there have been some success stories, but it's pretty hit and miss. I mean, surely these fundamental questions, perhaps, of equity need to be addressed first, even if you do bring private enterprise.
I mean, I think there is certainly a question of equity, and I think the focus really is we know we have around 1,550 what we call dropout factory schools, schools where less than 60% of freshmen become seniors 3 years later. And what that means is that the problem is targetable. We know where the students who need these supports go to school, and we know which kind of supports work.
Professor Reardon, I mean, that is an interesting point, though, that we've known about these problems for years. I mean, there have been many reports, like the one that we've been examining, which have pinpointed very similar issues over the years, over the decades. And in fact, this report asks several questions but doesn't answer them. And I wonder maybe if you can help us dig deeper to understand the problems involved. The first question it asks is, would a globally competitive country tolerate the fact that some states and districts spend 2 to 3 times per pupil more than their poorer counterparts when higher performing nations take fiscal equity among schools as a given? How did we get to the stage where this is tolerated in the U.S.?
Well, we have a very decentralized history of education. We have 50 different states, we have 16,000 school districts, and there is a sort of general historical philosophy towards local control. But I think there's a growing concern that the big disparities we see are a sort of issue of national concern. Now, there is some good news here, and I think it's worth highlighting that, and that is, on average, students perform much better on standardized tests today than they did 30 or 40 years ago. It's not that we're getting worse in terms of standardized test scores or graduation rates, which have gone up in the last decade, or college enrollment and completion rates. We're just not doing as well as I think a lot of people feel we need to sort of compete in the global economy and to ensure that everyone has a kind of equal chance for upward mobility.
Right, but I wonder whether there are wider economic issues involved in answering the question as to why the US is tolerating a situation like this. For example, Dr. Allegretto, another question raised, would a country serious about teacher excellence settle for having only 30% of its educators coming from the top third of the college pool, when the best school systems in the world recruit nearly all of their school talent from the top third? And how is it that we are alone among advanced countries in assigning our least prepared teachers to those who most need our best? And again, when we're trying to understand how this is tolerable, I wonder whether there are wider issues of economic policy and philosophy that come into this.
Well, absolutely. My own research has shown that teacher pay is falling far, far behind what it used to be. So you have to look at the opportunity cost of becoming a teacher today. And when you look at teacher pay, it is much less. There's a big gap between what teachers make and what other comparable college graduates with the same type of experience and education would make in other fields. So we're not recruiting the best and the brightest to be teachers anymore because they can do many other things. Back in the 50s and the 60s, we did have really great teachers because we had a captive labor pool. It was women. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for women, so a lot of really smart women went into teaching. So we have to make the profession a professional experience, and we have to up the pay of teachers so we can recruit and retain the best and the brightest to teach in our schools. And by the way, if you look at the private sector, those teachers even make less, because one of the reasons that I believe that we have this push to privatization, which is only going to make the situation worse for the low-income students. I don't believe that we can privatize anything where there's massive inequalities and think that that's going to mitigate inequalities. But those teachers that are teaching in the private schools that are largely non-union make even less, much less. And so we're making this kind of what should be a really good and high-paying profession into one that's lower and lower and lower paying over time.
Mary Root, I mean, that's what some argue, that despite reports like this, the rhetoric we hear from the White House, others in Washington, from Chicago, from Wisconsin, is that we should be curtailing the rights of teachers and pay and so forth, and their labor rights and their ability to collective bargain and so forth. Isn't that rather worrying, then?
I think teachers are part of the solution, and I think there's consensus that teachers are part of the solution. High-quality teachers are the biggest in-school driver of student success. That's completely true. Professor
Reardon, I mean, you do wonder then, again, I don't know whether I'm being too simplistic then about fashionable theories in education, but certainly the only theories that we do hear tend to be the ones propagated by, Bill Gates or others, which have this kind of private enterprise approach. I mean, is the complexity of running a successful education system comparable to the complexity of designing and marketing a successful operating system? I can see why it's seductive to think like that, but do you feel that sense has somehow taken hold?
Well, I think the education has a set of public goods. We want it to serve democracy. We want children to be educated, not just to have sort of a set of skills that will let them be successful in the marketplace, but we want them to be educated to be sort of effective, compassionate, empathetic, engaged members of a democratic society, which is a different set of goals than the sort of private goals of education. And so I wonder sometimes whether or not the kind of private model doesn't sort of miss some of the democratic aims of education. The other thing I think is important to get on the table is there's a lot of rhetoric today about how important teachers are, and there's no question that they're important. But the gaps between high and low income students in terms of their academic skills are enormous at the time they enter the kindergarten doorway. And And it's a lot easier to remedy those problems early in childhood, or to prevent those problems early in childhood, than to expect teachers and schools to be able to remedy those enormous gaps once kids have gotten to kindergarten. And that's why I think it's so important to focus on investing in early childhood strategies, high-quality childcare, high-quality preschool, attracting skilled, high-paid teachers to the early childhood market. That kind of investment pays off enormously later on and makes the work of K through 12 schools much, much easier.
Professor Reardon, what would you say are the solutions that we could reach to beyond then a greater investment in preschool education?
Well, I think, you know, if you ask me the one thing to spend money on that would return on the investment many-fold, it would be investments in early childhood education. That's not to say we shouldn't do more in the K-12 schools. We could do a lot more to try to improve the teaching in schools that are serving low-income students, to move better teachers into those schools, to attract better college graduates into the teaching profession, to fund our schools better. All of that is very important, but probably the single best investment, and I think we should think of it as an investment, not as a spending thing, would be in early childhood. The studies show that every dollar invested in early childhood education can return $5 to $7 in terms of savings to society later on. So it's kind of a no-brainer. If someone said, give me $1 now and I'll give you $7 down the road, that would seem like a great investment, and I think it's a great investment for society.
But Dr. Allegretto, arguably though, without jobs, with higher education still being prohibitively expensive, I mean, now you need it says, the New York Times had a report that you need a degree to be a receptionist now. Even enacting these reforms will have little impact necessarily on social mobility.
Yeah, I think, first of all, most Americans are shocked that, you know, we have much less mobility, economic mobility, than most Americans think. I mean, where you begin has much more to do with where you end up in life than just about anything else, although education could, again, potentially mitigate that. And, you know, you can't really have this discussion without talking about the broader economy. I mean, you know, these areas that are struggling, the schools that are struggling, you know, it's not just the kids, it's the whole communities. There's not enough jobs. There's not an investment in enough investment in, for instance, job creation. The jobs that a lot of folks have in these areas are low quality, low-paying jobs. We have to do something about that. We have far too many people that are working poor, for instance. You know, these are a lot of other policy areas that we have to take care of. The fact that these children, you know, often, you know, for instance, don't have other things like health care. You know, provided, and their parents don't have health care. And, you know, so we have to invest in communities and schools. I mean, there's a whole, you know, litany of things here, but all of these things are kind of affected by the vast amount of inequality that we've accumulated over the last 30 or 40 years in this country. We have the level of inequality that really, you know, dictates more of a plutocracy than a democracy. I feel that, you know, we talked a lot about this during the Occupy Wall Street of the last few years, for instance, so it's come into the public perception of things. But it truly is one of the biggest problems we have is that for instance, the growth the growth that has finally started to happen since the Great Recession, all of the benefits of that growth have gone to the top 1% and then some. 121% of the growth in the last few years have gone to the top 1%. So they took all the growth and then some. So actually inequality now has gotten much worse post-Great Recession, which is going to make it even harder to remedy these situations.
So is that why you're a bit suspicious when the supposed solutions to the education problem come from exactly the same people who designed that system, that economic system?
Absolutely, and I'm really disheartened when you know, on one hand I hear President Obama talk about universal pre-K, and then on the other hand I hear him say it's not going to cost us anything. That tells me we're not really ready to invest in that, you know, because we should be investing horribly now. We have hundreds of thousands of teachers that have been laid off due to the Great Recession. We should hire all those teachers back like tomorrow, and invest in universal pre-K. We can borrow money money for almost nothing. We should be borrowing like crazy and investing in our education system and our infrastructure and everything else that President Obama talked about in the State of the Union. But it's disheartening to somehow say that we're not going to really spend any money to do it.
Dr. Allegretto, thank you very much. Professor Reardon, thank you. Mary Bruce, thank you too. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.